Good morning, everyone. We'll be getting started in a couple of minutes. We want to give everyone time to get logged on here. Before we get going, I do want to mention that this webinar will be recorded today. So an archived version of the webinar and all presentation materials will be available and distributed after the broadcast. So with that said, we'll be getting going in about 2 minutes. Okay, we'll be getting underway now. I also want to mention that if you have questions anytime throughout the presentation, you can feel free to pop them in the questions area there, and I will pause periodically to answer any questions that anyone has. I also want to explain that this will not be a comprehensive overview of web accessibility requirements. Instead, our goal today is to give you the basics and then show you where you can go to learn more information, access checklists, guidance, or self-assessment. So we'll get started here. So who am I? I'm Dr. Casey Anderson with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support. Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support creates supports and delivers professional development for career and tech ed professionals across Illinois. We also develop technical publications, facilitate program improvement strategies for our partners as they relate to tuition and access. And my specific qualifications for being here today are that ICSPS has expertise in civil rights issues in the secondary and post-secondary system. We conduct civil rights reviews with the Community College Board and the Illinois State Board of Education. And as part of our technical assistance duties, we are working to help schools across Illinois move forward with web accessibility and online accessibility. So the presentation today is going to follow this structure. The first is we'll have an introduction to the basics of web accessibility. We'll briefly overview requirements and guidance related to web accessibility. Then we'll look specifically at accessibility for websites, posted documents, and then review self-assessment strategies and resources that you can. Our introduction here, what we really want to get at is what's the idea behind web accessibility? Because there's a lot that can be really overwhelming when you start to get into the legislation, the specific requirements, coding elements, all of that. And so before we start looking at any of those more overwhelming elements, I want to take a step back and say, what is the goal of web accessibility and what is it that we're really trying to do? So creating accessible content requires consideration for users with a wide range of disabilities, including visual, auditory, physical, speech, cognitive, language, learning, and neurological abilities. People with disabilities may make use of user agents or accessible technology devices that allow for access of a wider range of content. These include standard features that are common on web browsers and media players to more complex assistive technologies like screen readers. So below, I've listed a few common onboard accessibility features that almost all of us have access to on the standard computer programs we use, including screen magnification, screen readers, and voice recorders that are common on Microsoft products, sticky keys, which is something that happens if you press shift a bunch and then allows you to use one-handed keyboard operation, the web ability to disengage page style sheets, and we'll talk a little more about that later. And then on the right-hand side, I've got some examples of other assistive technologies. So what are we really talking about when we're looking at web accessibility? We are talking about how to expand access to all of the information that we put online to everyone, regardless of any sort of disability they may have. And there's another consideration that relates to web accessibility and equity, and that's the concept of internet speed. For a lot of us, that might not be an issue, but some of the things that we'll discuss, like style sheets, are really important for giving access to information for people with weak internet connections, limited access to internet, or bandwidth requirements. So, what are some of the principles of accessibility that we'll be talking about? World Wide Web Consortium, which is also known as W3C, gives 4 principles of accessibility. And I've cited this particular resource because the World Wide Web Consortium has developed a set of guidelines that are considered the standard in the field for achieving accessibility compliance. So those 4 principles are that information must be perceivable, information and user interface components must be presentable to all users in ways they can perceive, so they cannot be invisible. And that's going to be something that is really important when we consider things like graphic elements, color, layout, because the entire point of this perceivable piece is that some things that are apparent for some users may not even be able to be interacted with by others, depending on the disability or the type of assistive technology they'll be using. The second step there is operable. User interface components and navigation must be operable. The interface cannot require interaction that users cannot perform. A really common problem related to accessibility comes in the terms of physical forms. When some forms can't be or some fields can't be moved on until there's information put in them, or timeout, time requirements make it so that those forms cannot be completed with assistive technology in the time required before the form erases itself or restarts. So that's just one example of operable features. And we'll touch on a large amount of those throughout this presentation. Third is understandable. Information and the operation of user interfaces must be understandable. This is a really pretty simple concept that can get really convoluted if you start trying to pick apart legislation. Basically, people need to be able to understand and navigate in a logical manner around websites. And then finally, robust. Content must be robust enough that it can be interpreted reliably by a wide variety of user agents, including assistive technologies. As technologies and user agents evolve, the content should remain accessible. One of the biggest barriers that school districts often run to is when they develop web platforms for their websites or develop content in-house and then don't look forward in terms of what might be needed in the future and what sorts of technologies might become available. So robust is really important when we're considering the design of websites, the platforms they're being used on, and the idea that the needs of right now might not necessarily fit the needs of students and the public in the future. So what are the guidance and standards? There are several elements here that we're going to look at, and I'm not going to get into a real deep dive of any of these specific guidance or standards. However, if you are interested, on the ICSPS website, which you'll find links to throughout this presentation, there is a real in-depth discussion of Section 508 requirements for web accessibility under the Rehabilitation Act. But the guidance and standards we're talking about are Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act. These provide protections for people with disabilities and prevent non-discrimination. 508 is where we interpret a lot of the broad level guidance to prevent discrimination. Or I'm sorry, 504 is where we get that broad level guidance. And then 508 is where we find the really specific technical requirements and the expectations for what is web accessibility and electronic accessibility. Other broad level interpretations come from the Americans with Disability Act, which requires equal access to people with disabilities, and the courts have determined that that applies to websites and electronic communications as well. Within Illinois, we have the Illinois Information Technology and Accessibility Act. It tends to go above and beyond either the Section 508 requirements or any requirements within the Americans with Disability Act. And throughout the presentation, you'll see it referenced because it is the most stringent of the required laws that you need to follow in Illinois. I've also put the WCAG 2.0 standards up on there. So as I referenced earlier, the World Wide Web Consortium has created a set of recommendations that are considered the industry standard for web accessibility. These standards provide web content accessibility guidelines that go beyond legislative requirements and provide a series of best practices. Really importantly, there are 3 levels of accessibility granted within the WCAG 2.0 standards. The standard for compliance is considered to be the level AA, whereas AAA is the highest level of compliance. The IITAA, the Illinois Information Technology Accessibility Act, also specifically defines the range of disabilities that must be accommodated. That includes people with limited vision, people who are blind, people with hearing loss, people who are deaf, people with limited speech, people with no speech, which I've accidentally included in there twice, and people with no reach or touch. However, they do give guidance that other disabilities should also be considered, but it's that must word there that is really important for our discussion today. I've put up a list of the guidance standards here and links to where they can be found. I would highly recommend anyone who is in charge of web accessibility and compliance actually take a look at some of these standards and look at the different guidance that's associated with them. IITAA actually also contains an FAQ that guides users on how to achieve some of this compliance. It mirrors very closely those WC3 standards provided by the World Wide Web Consortium. I'd also like to point out that ICSPS has an archived webinar that specifically goes through all of the 508 standards in depth. I'm going to warn you right now that it is a long webinar and it is very, very technical. So this is a great thing. If you really have one specific question about one requirement, skip to that part, look through it, see the discussion that takes place, or if you're having trouble sleeping at night, you can pop this on and I promise it'll put you right to sleep. But it is very useful in terms of getting a more in-depth understanding of what's required at each specific component of web accessibility. So now we're going to look at some basic concepts of web accessibility. But before I do that, I would once again like to mention that there is a question pane that you all have access to. If at any point you'd like to go ahead and put any questions in there, I'll stop and answer them. Those can be about the general concepts or really specific issues. If I can't give you an answer right now, I will do my best to follow up with every question that's asked after the webinar. So, all right, let's move on to basic concepts of website accessibility. Again, what I'm not doing here is going through and giving you specific citations. Instead, I'm going to provide some broad level concepts and give examples of what those actually look like. So requirements for websites relate primarily to navigation and the ability to understand information presented. There are also a lot of those requirements that are related to the robustness of websites that we described before, but a lot of that is more determined by the platform in which your website is built on than the actual contents of the website itself. So if you have any questions about that, feel free to ask them, but I'm going to focus on the navigation and ability to understand information issues. The best way to achieve compliance related to those issues is to properly label and organize website elements so that any user, regardless of disability or assistive technology use, would be able to navigate that in a logical fashion. So I've provided 2 specific examples here. Example 1, a site is organized so it is readable without an associated style sheet. This does not mean that a style sheet can't be used, refers only to the logical order of presentation of materials. I know these are small pictures, but on the two pictures there you can see our center's website, ICSPS. The one on the left has the style sheet applied. So that's your basic web browser presentation that most users would experience. The one on the left. The one on the right has the style sheet turned off. So as you can see, the navigation bars that we see at the top of the picture on the left side are presented directly above the picture on the right side. Then we move into a logical presentation of the other elements in the main body of the site. And if I had included more of this picture, we'd scroll down and we'd get to the other pieces of information in the site, including our archived resources, our larger monthly archives, and our search feature. All of that can be navigated and understood in a logical order, despite the style sheet that it's associated with it and the way it's broken up for users who are not using assistive technology. I also want to point out that being able to turn off the style sheet is something that is capable on almost every web browser, and the style sheet is generally determined by the templates you use when you're actually on the creation part of your web platform instead of, say, the piece you use to enter text and add pictures. So for example 2, we're going to discuss text a little bit. So recommendations are to use headings to introduce sections and subsections and use them in the correct order. I didn't have a really great example of this in terms of a common website most people would use. So instead I've mocked up 2 little screens down here, and you can see on the left side would be the user view, the view that we would have if this text was plugged into a website. On the right-hand side, you can actually see the coding element that is used to include this in a website editor. The little points in front, the H1 and H2, are heading elements that determine how they're actually used. And importantly, these heading structure components are not simply font and style. Heading structures can look like almost anything as long as they have that H1 or H2 tag applied to them. So important considerations for when you're developing heading structures on websites are website editors are not designed to work like word processors. Font options are separate from the formatting options, so I can add heading tags and then still adjust the font size, bold, underline, all those elements independently to determine how it will look to my users. And then really importantly, sometimes multiple options produce the same look. So this isn't something you can easily assess by just looking at it visually. The best way for self-assessment would be to actually use assistive technology or go in to look at the code as I've put up on the right-hand side. Now, we're going to move on to some basic concepts of document accessibility. Accessibility rules apply to all posted content that appears on websites. All documents should be constructed so they're navigable by assistive technology. So the factors I've listed here will actually impact all sorts of different documents that are put up online, including pictures that are embedded into websites directly, PDFs that are posted, things like this PowerPoint that I'm going to post up after the webinar, and every different one of those actually needs to be accessible in its own right. So one of the factors to consider is that equivalent text must be provided for all non-textual elements. The most common example of a violation under 504 that would be found related to these equivalent text elements would be alt tags on pictures. And that is just the text that is tied to a picture to describe it to a user who can't engage with the picture directly. This textual element applies to tables, pictures, graphs, charts, and multimedia. Alt text captioning, alternative accessible formats like a plain text version of a document, or a lot of different other elements can be used to achieve compliance related to this equivalent text requirement. So at the end of the presentation, I'm going to show you some resources, and under those resources, there are different guides and templates, walkthroughs, video tutorials for how to achieve or how to input alt text, add captioning, create accessible formats, and those cover MS products, Adobe products as well, and they are products specific. So one thing you'll find would be a PowerPoint presentation that's about 10 minutes long that walks you through all of the major accessibility considerations for PowerPoint. Another factor would be color. So color should not be used as the only means of conveying information. This is really common when, say, worksheets are put up online to be downloaded, that sometimes color indicators are used to show something that is not like another grouping. That is not allowable. One of the easy ways around that would be to do something like add it in bold or put an underline on that. And this is related to people who have difficulty determining different color aspects, who need high contrast resolution, or use assistive technology that doesn't interact with color elements directly. So another piece of this specific concept would also then be color contrasts in your materials. I think anyone who's ever tried to read white text on a light blue background can understand how difficult and frustrating that can be. There are very specific requirements for what the contrast ratio has to be for different colors used on websites. You should also ensure fillable forms are accessible by assistive technology. A quick word on this is fillable forms are used in almost everything we do at this point. Some programs to design fillable forms are better than others. For example, Word features or Word documents that include fillable forms are almost never accessible by assistive technology. There have not been updates to that program that allow for certain types of assistive technology to navigate it. And some of the resources I'll show will provide further guidance on these as well. Lists and heading structures make sure documents are much easier to navigate using assistive technology. Most software has pre-created, is what that's supposed to say, headings tag styles. So if you use these, remember that they're not just aesthetic. If you click heading 1 from a Word document menu, it will add those heading tags I was referring to earlier. The same can be said for things like captions in pictures or charts. Each of those different textual elements may have a separate heading. So when possible, always try to use the pre-constructed styles because they have those worked into them. And again, remember that you can then change the font, color, style, even in a Word document to make it look how you want to, but you'll be sure then that the tags are there. Importantly, if you do use lists, bulleted lists, or heading style lists, do not skip levels because that can make it appear as if there is nothing following that list level to someone who's trying to navigate or scan with assistive technology. Again, some programs can't be made fully accessible, so the fillable form example from Microsoft Word. Also, PDF documents are really well known for not being accessible. That's because for PDFs to be accessible at all, they have to have tag elements embedded. And before we end this webinar, I am going to quickly show you how that can be achieved. But all PDFs require their structure tags to be enabled before they can be made accessible. And that has to be done when you save it from the document that's being converted to a PDF. Accessible alternatives are permissible but should be avoided unless absolutely necessary. So one of the common examples of this would be providing a video that instead of captioning, you provide a full or a text script that was followed. So that can technically achieve 508 compliance. Note it needs to be verbatim for what was said, and also that it is only acceptable when no other means of accessibility can be created. And then I do have a point there to reference the standard. And some of these things are very technical. I'm happy to provide follow-up technical assistance or answer any questions you might have, but we're looking at the brief overview today, and then I'm going to give you the resources that will let you do. So, concepts of document accessibility. If you're creating a document that's going to be posted online, you should always check that the following elements have been made accessible. 1, the headings and structure. 2, reading order. 3, images. 4, tables. And 5, lists. Sometimes these aren't as easy as they look. So for example, reading order in a PDF document, even if you enable accessibility tags and have structured the source document well, it's often, most of the time, required that some touch-ups and changes need to be made to the reading order. There are guides on how to do that on the ICSPS web accessibility resources that you can see on the right-hand side of the screen. But the process of the PDF program and the source program communicating to each other often makes it so that the reading order is not delivered as intended. So that's why self-assessment, which is something we're going to talk about in a minute, becomes so important. Images, your main concern there is alt tags. Tables have a whole list of guidelines that they should follow, but in general, simple tables are better than more complex ones. So heading rows need to be provided, and you shouldn't merge different layers of the table so that there are irregular points for navigation and for understanding. It really important also, tables should not be used for organizing text. They are very difficult to create accessibility around when you're using them as a aesthetic structure. So there are a lot of other things like the headings and structure elements that can be used to achieve those same goals. And then in terms of headings and structure and list, I would often recommend that you use whatever onboard features are already available to create those instead of trying to format them yourself. When creating a PDF from another program, as I said, those structure tags need to be enabled. So here I've listed how you can do that, at least for Microsoft products. So located under the File menu, you'll click Save As, More Options, and select PDF from the drop-down menu. Then click the Options icon and check Document Structure Tags for accessibility. Make sure that's turned on. Without that enabled, no information at all will be able to be accessed by accessible technology on PDFs. So they can't be made accessible, and anything you've built into Word or a PowerPoint, for example, any of those elements above will be erased when that document is created. Another resource that I've provided here is the U.S. General Service Administration. This is a particularly good resource page for Section 508 compliance because it includes checklists, self-assessment techniques, and FAQs for all of the main programs that people are using to create online documents. Some of the more design-heavy programs like InDesign or Publisher are not included on there, but if you need accessibility guidelines on those, I'll work to find some for you to make that process as easy as possible. All right. We're getting closer to the end here, so again, if you have any questions, feel free to put those in at any time. I will pause when appropriate to answer them. So this slide's entitled When in Doubt, Self-Assess. And I can't stress enough the importance of looking at documents before you post them or running accessibility checkers on your website periodically to make sure that any policies and practices you have in place to ensure web accessibility are actually being followed. So I've listed a few here, free web accessibility checkers for your website. You generally just click on this site, put in the URL of the website you want to check, and it will list any potential violations that it finds. And for the w3.org version, it will also give you guidance on how to correct some of those. So Wave Web Accessibility Evaluation Tool identifies potential issues, creates a visual markup of your site to actually show you exactly where that's occurring, and it identifies structural elements that may be problematic but would require closer examination. So that would be a kind of warning or a recommendation that it would give you, as opposed to highlighting in red and listing as a problem area. So that's a really robust tool for helping you understand what is happening on your website and where those violations are occurring. And then again, the w3.org one is a very good tool because it provides links to how you can then achieve compliance. So then in terms of your documents you're creating to put online, there are some onboard tools for accessibility that I would highly recommend you run every time you save a document if your intent is to put it online. The first is in all MS Office products, and that's Accessibility Checker. It's located in the File menu, and then Info. You click Check for Issues, and it checks accessibility, and it runs through all of the common accessibility issues that you'll find in Word documents, and then actually gives you prompts on how to fix them. I do want to give a little caveat that the only thing this will not identify are fillable form issues in MS Word. And as I've said previously, those simply cannot be made accessible based on how technology interacts with that specific program. So I've also mentioned that PDFs are much more difficult to create accessible content in. And so I've provided some onboard tools here in Adobe products, but generally these are not available only in the free products. They're available in the paid version. So the first is the PDF Accessibility Checker. It's located in the Advanced menu. You can run a quick check and it will do the same as the other accessibility checkers that have been listed above. However, then to change any problems you find, Adobe has something called the Touch-Up Reading Order tool. It's located under the Advanced menu in Accessibility, then Touch-Up Reading Order, and it allows you to edit the reading order for text or so that a text reader can interact with it. The order usually set by the order in which content is created, not by the logical structure, but again, that's not always the case. So this is a very intensive process where you have to open each page individually, examine the structure tags using the Touch-Up Reading Order tool, and then reorder them or draw over them in a specific logical order that you want the document to follow. The final one there is the Touch-Up Object tool. So this is where you will actually engage with pictures and tables to put in things like alt text. Alt text in MS Office is a simple option. When you click the picture and click Format, you can actually enter in alt text. You have to use the Touch-Up or Object tool in Adobe, and it's found under the Tools menu, Advanced Editing, and Touch-Up Object. There are also guides for those MS Office products and Adobe Touch-Up Reading Order and Touch-Up Object tools on the ICSPS website on those resources that have been provided. So, what are the available resources to really help you get in and dig in deep with this? The first is our website under Web Accessibility Resources. If you search Web Accessibility or look up Electronic and Web Accessibility Webinar Series, you'll find full walkthroughs of accessibility requirements in terms of archived webinars and archived webinar slideshows. You'll find checklists that you can run through as you create documents to ensure that it's compliant. Video tutorials that walk you through different versions of Word, PowerPoint, Adobe to actually see where some of these features can be found and how to use them. And then other resources, as we find them, we put up so that you'll have a place you can go to see what's out there and in relation to web accessibility. So the U.S. General Service Administration, I've also put this up before, has an extensive resource list related to creating accessible content and self-assessing. It's a great web page where you can pick the type of content you're looking to understand accessibility about, and then find multiple different guides and assessment tools. WebAIM is a comprehensive resource for web accessibility. They're a nonprofit organization that offers as many web accessibility resource tools and guidance as you can think of. They are generally the best place to start if you don't know what it is you're really looking for. Though because the entire website is about web accessibility, it can be a little overwhelming if you're just trying to get a 101 level understanding. Instead, this is a great place to go for those more comprehensive resources. But again, things like guides, checklists, and self-assessment tools can also be found there. The World Wide Web Consortium contains a full list of WCAG 2.0 standards, explanations of specific issues, and best practices. This is a great website where if you've identified a compliance issue and need to know how to solve it, visit w3.org, and then you can navigate to those specific standards and find FAQs about them, compliance guides, all sorts of things, but it is organized by standard and 508 requirement. So that's all the material I've prepared. I would encourage anyone with any questions at all about anything you've seen today, any other web accessibility issues, to go ahead and reach out to us. We're icsps@illinoisstate.edu. My name's Casey Anderson. My contact info is on the first slide, which will be provided to you. So you can call me or email me absolutely anytime. And if you have any other questions or topics you'd like to see professional development on related to web accessibility, feel free to let us know. So thank you very much.